slender and tall. She was so beautiful that many English knights who encountered her in Dover were left breathless. Dressed in magnificent robes and draped in a fur cloak, it was February, and a biting wind swept through the area. Isabella of France truly embodied the essence of a queen. It was no coincidence that her father, Philip IV, was dubbed the Fair, nor that France and England had waged war for 5 years due to her aunt, Blanche. Members of this lineage were impressively beautiful. No one suspected at that time, at the beginning of the 14th century, that the new English queen, young Isabella, would become the cause of yet another war, and that she would forever be remembered in history as the she-wolf. Isabella was born. However, historians debate the exact date of her birth. The age difference between her and her future husband, Edward, was nearly 11 years, not unusual for that time. The daughter of King Philip of France and Joanna of Navarre was raised in the royal palace on the Isle de la Cite, in the heart of Paris, and received an excellent education for a woman of her era. Records indicate that new books were regularly purchased for Isabella. The girl, who could have had all of Europe at her feet, loved to read. When the princess was just 4 years old, discussions about her marriage began. France and England were weary of war, and the Pope proposed a double alliance. Isabella's aunt, Princess Margaret, would marry the widowed King Edward I, and the girl would become the wife of his son, Prince Edward. This close kinship was meant to ensure future amicable relations. Why not? Sometimes it worked. The agreement was only half fulfilled. Margaret immediately left for London, while the princess remained in Paris. At that time, it was considered that the marriageable age for young ladies was 12. Although there were instances of much earlier marriages, if political circumstances demanded it, Isabella was allowed to grow up peacefully at home. King Edward I passed away. It is said that on his deathbed, he urged his son to marry Isabella of France immediately. The monarch feared that his neighbor might change his mind, as had happened before, and that peace between the countries would become fragile. Edward II promised to honor the long-standing agreement. As soon as the period of deep mourning ended, he set off for France. This union was eagerly anticipated. The dying king had worried for nothing. Philip was systematically marrying off his relatives to European princes and rulers. He too wanted to avoid military conflicts. Isabella's marriage was carefully planned, and no expense was spared for the wedding ceremony. According to the agreement between the countries, the princess was to bring gold to London and, in return, receive all the lands and estates that belonged to her Aunt Margaret. But the primary foundation of the alliance remained, above all, the peace between the states. The wedding ceremony took place in Boulogne. The bells rang tirelessly. 8 kings and queens gathered for this celebration. Let's not forget Isabella. Now she was called the Queen of England. Not every royal can boast such illustrious guests at their wedding ceremony. The wedding festivities lasted for a week and a half, after which the newlyweds began to prepare for their return home. Isabella was accompanied by a lavish, large entourage, part of which was meant to stay with her in London, to ensure that their relative received a proper welcome and that all formalities were observed. 2 of her uncles escorted the Queen of England across the Channel. Among them was Charles of Valois, who would play a significant role in the unfolding story. Isabella landed on the English coast on February 7, 1308. A wave of excited whispers swept through the crowd. What a queen she was! Proud, statuesque, and dignified. And what a beauty! Only one knight seemed completely indifferent to her, Piers de Gaveston, who immediately rushed to greet King Edward II before finally acknowledging the queen with a casual nod. The French were unsettled. The English king's greeting with his favorite was far too affectionate, but a true scandal awaited them. On the day of Isabella's coronation, Sir Gaveston appeared at court dressed in royal purple, adorned with pearls and a mantle. Moreover, it was he whom King Edward entrusted with carrying the sacred English crown, the crown of St. Edward. He looked more like a god than a mere mortal, they said in Westminster about Piers Gaveston, and this was an affront to the king. The discontent of the French was shared by English barons. After the coronation, A demand arose to banish Gaveston from London, and Edward reluctantly had to agree. But did this make Isabella happier? Unfortunately, no. Although her husband spent Christmas with her in Windsor and paid her all the necessary attentions befitting her position, soon the favorite returned. Edward's attention shifted back to him. He is arrogant and haughty, Isabella wrote to her father. He thinks he is the one ruling England. Isabella experienced a deep disappointment. On one hand, she was beloved by the people. On the other, her husband avoided her company, visiting her chamber only after several reminders. Even her father, the king, wrote to Edward about his marital duties and the necessity of fulfilling them. Philip was extremely concerned about his daughter's situation in England. It was no surprise that Isabella became pregnant only 4 years after the wedding. She was expecting when the baronial rebellion broke out. With anxiety, Isabella watched events unfold and was reportedly in correspondence with some of the rebellion's instigators. Their goals aligned. The queen hated the favorite, and the barons dreamed of getting rid of him. After Gaveston's execution, Isabella breathed a sigh of relief. Soon after, her firstborn arrived, Prince Edward, who would later be known as Edward III in the list of English kings. At that time, there was no happier woman in Europe than Isabella. The Queen of England and wife of Edward II, she had just given birth to an heir. The joy of continuing the dynasty eased the king's sorrow over the loss of his favorite. At last, the king recognized the intelligence of his wife. In short, nothing hinted that a rift would one day emerge between them, or that the stunningly beautiful Isabella would soon be referred to as the she-wolf. The content king was generous. He allocated nearly double the funds for his wife's upkeep compared to before. However, his treasury was now depleted, and money was constantly needed. After all, a war was being waged against Scotland in the north. Thus, Edward and Isabella gladly accepted an invitation from the French King Philip to visit Paris. It was a convenient opportunity to borrow some money. The formal reason for the meeting was the knighting of Isabella's brothers. In truth, King Philip wanted to ensure that his daughter was well. His worries from the previous year, the baronial rebellion, and Isabella's complaints about her husband's favorite had deeply troubled the French monarch. Seeing his beloved daughter smile, he sighed in relief. However, things did not go as planned for either side in Paris. Yes, Edward managed to secure a loan from his father-in-law. And yes, King Philip had ample opportunity to chat with his clever daughter and admire her once again. But the visit had a tragic outcome. It seemed that Isabella uncovered the truth about the infidelities of 3 princesses. At that time, 3 frivolous young women lived joyfully in the royal palace, the wives of Isabella's 3 brothers. By the time of Isabella's next visit, it was established that at least 2 of the princesses, Marguerite of Navarre, the wife of the heir to the throne and king of Navarre, and Blanche of Burgundy, were unfaithful to their husbands. As for the third, Jane, nothing could be determined except that she was covering for her relatives. The role of Isabella was brilliantly described by the novelist Maurice Drouin, but historians have yet to reach a consensus on it. Did the Queen of England truly expose her sisters-in-law? Or was she unjustly blamed simply because she happened to be back in her homeland at that time? Regardless, an incredible scandal erupted. The 3 accused young women were imprisoned in castles, and France's future was suddenly in jeopardy. The issue was that the heir to the throne, Louis of Navarre, had one daughter from his unfaithful wife. Now the legitimacy of little Jean was in question. Was she a princess, or merely the daughter of a horse steward? In any case, Jean was a girl, and according to French laws, only males could inherit the crown. As for the other 2 offspring of King Philip, they also had no sons. Who would continue the dynasty? The relatives of the princesses unleashed their fury on Isabella. Of course, from a distance. The queen returned to England, where she had her own troubles, as the Scots had defeated the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, and King Edward barely escaped unharmed. Now the parties were preparing to negotiate peace, which meant they had to release the long-held hostage, Queen Elizabeth of Burgundy. The following year, a terrible famine struck England, claiming the lives of thousands. The king and queen were forced to drastically cut their expenses, especially since the French funds had run out. Isabella literally had to patch up her old dresses. The gloomy Christmas of 1315 was brightened only by the news of Isabella's new pregnancy. A year later, another son was born, named John. The position of the queen in the dynasty became more secure. Some estates that Edward had previously granted to his favorite, Gaveston, now belonged to Isabella. However, the situation in the country remained dire. Edward's popularity waned as bread prices soared. When a pretender emerged, claiming to be the true King Edward, allegedly, they had been swapped in their cradles, Isabella became genuinely alarmed. The prestige of the monarchy had already suffered. Fortunately, the false Edward was soon captured and executed. The Scots continued to be a thorn in their side as well. Supporters of the Bruce family devised a bold plan to kidnap Queen Isabella and her children, and it was sheer luck that it was never carried out. However, real troubles lay ahead. King Edward brought the Despencer family closer to him. The head of the family, a man deemed greedy and cruel by his contemporaries, was granted high positions. But an even greater elevation awaited his son, Hugh the Younger. He became the new Gaveston for the king, wielding near unlimited power. Thus, Queen Isabella of France faced a formidable opponent. The Despencer clan was eager for power and, in their insatiable greed, demanded more titles and money from Edward. The English queen, mother of the heirs to the throne, no longer felt secure. The time was coming when the she-wolf would have to show her true nature. Legend has it that Queen Isabella fell to her knees, pleading with her husband to banish the Despensers. The barons were also dissatisfied. Lands, castles, and titles were taken from some to be joyfully enjoyed by the new favorite and his family. Both Hughs gained more power with each passing day, and even a brief exile, under pressure from the barons, did not change the situation. Once again, a rebellion arose. The Battle of Shrewsbury took place, where Roger Mortimer, one of the main opponents of the Despencer clan, was defeated. Then Thomas Lancaster was captured and executed. The Mortimers got off with a stint in the Tower. The rebellion was followed by a reaction that directly affected Isabella. Her allowance was slashed several times, and at least 2 of the castles previously granted to her were taken away. Moreover, the favorites dared to encroach upon the queen's morning gift, something that, by all medieval laws, should have remained inviolable. England was not ruled by Edward. In fact, it was the Despensers who were calling the shots. The Queen's situation worsened significantly after the war broke out on the continent. The issue was that the English king was required to pay homage to the King of France due to his holdings on French territory. It seemed like a simple matter, a visit to see relatives and pledge loyalty. But Edward stubbornly refused. In his view, kings in Paris changed too frequently, which was true, and he couldn't keep making the trip. Edward's refusal led to armed conflict. The French seized his lands, and Queen Isabella felt the full force of her husband's wrath. Her already meager allowance was completely taken away, and all her lands were confiscated. Now, the rightful Queen of England began to seriously fear for her life. The war dragged on, and peace was desperately needed. Isabella would be the best negotiator with the French king, and Edward reluctantly agreed. The Queen of England set sail for her homeland. She succeeded. The warring parties reached a peace treaty, and after such a successful mission, Isabella should have returned home, but she was in no hurry. On the contrary, she decided to linger in her brother's lands, now ruled by Charles IV, known as Charles the Beautiful, and proposed a humane solution to preserve her husband's royal honor. What if all the lands of the English crown on this side of the Channel were governed by her eldest son? This had happened before in history. For instance, Richard the Lionheart managed the French fief while his father ruled in England. The homage could then be paid not by the king, but by the prince, the heir to the crown. This was a clever strategic move. Edward had fallen into a trap. He allowed his eldest son to go to his wife to pay homage, but after fulfilling Isabella's plan, he too did not return to London. Now, a second English court had established itself in the capital of France. Isabella did not hide that she was gathering supporters. Edward II wrote her letters demanding her return, but received no response. The King of England then began writing to the French monarch, but the replies were almost mocking. "I understand your outrage, but I can't just send away my own sister." Then Roger Mortimer arrived in Paris. Historians mark this as the beginning of their romance. Isabella felt like a truly happy woman. If that was the case, why return to dreary England? To see Edward's glum face? To watch him surrender the kingdom to Hugh? Upon learning of his wife's infidelity, Edward flew into a rage. He even insisted that the Pope intervene. But Isabella was already plotting other plans. She began negotiations on several fronts, with the Scots, with English barons dissatisfied with Edward's rule, and with the French, who could support her. A coup was in the works. The financial and diplomatic preparations for the impending overthrow concluded in the north. Isabella found support in Hainaut, where she soon traveled with her son and lover. In exchange for the help of William of Hainaut, the Queen of England promised to arrange a marriage between Prince Edward and his daughter Philippa. 8 warships were headed for the shores of England. William of Hainaut had kept his promise. Now Isabella of France, soon to be known as the She-Wolf, had the forces and resources to confront the Despensers. The first contingent of the Queen of England landed on the eastern coast of the island. Moving forward was just a matter of time. Edward II learned of his wife's movements while she was still on the continent. He had his spies. Now, after Isabella's landing, he was determined to stand against her. He resorted to what he believed was a reliable tactic. He issued a proclamation to his subjects. Interestingly, Isabella did the same. However, she held the trump cards. She called on the English to unite against the Despenser clan, which threatened the peace and stability of the kingdom. What could Edward counter with? Very weak arguments. After several years of famine in the realm, and in light of the ostentatious luxury enjoyed by the two Hughs, the people were not inclined to support the king. It was no surprise that Isabella advanced easily toward the capital. She was welcomed as a protector, a savior. Soon, she was joined by the brother of the executed Thomas Lancaster, as well as Edward's own brother, Norfolk. In Hereford, Bishop Orleton delivered scathing speeches against the favorites. Meanwhile, the English capital began to stir with unrest. Edward was forced to flee. In a cowardly move, he abandoned his son John in the Tower. Isabella's forces besieged and captured Bristol, where the elder Despenser was hiding. He was also holding the Queen's 2 daughters, hoping to use them as hostages. A month later, Edward was captured along with his favorite, Hugh the Younger. Both Despensers, the elder and the younger, were executed in front of a large crowd. It is said that Isabella did not insist on the sentence for the elder Hugh, as her main adversary was his son. However, the Queen's supporters pressed for it, and she had to comply. Although she was formally in charge of everything happening in England, the power of the barons could not be underestimated. Yet even as a prisoner, Edward was still referred to as king. Under favorable circumstances, he could potentially regain power. Thus, the proposal to depose him emerged. At the January session of Parliament, this question became the main topic, and the idea of deposition was fervently supported by everyone except the bishops. Orleton's voice, preaching that a mad king will ruin his people, was drowned out by the voices of protesting clergy. No one dared express dissent any longer. In these circumstances, Prince Edward displayed unexpected stubbornness. He told his mother and all those gathered that he would not accept the crown if it were taken from his father. Only under the conditions of the king's voluntary abdication was he willing to become the next sovereign of England. A delegation was sent to Kenilworth Castle, where King Edward was held. They immediately informed him that the matter regarding him was essentially resolved. Those present at the meeting later claimed that the monarch abdicated in tears. Now, the prince could become Edward III, but until he reached adulthood, the kingdom would be governed by a regency council, of course, led by Isabella and Mortimer. Historians still debate the circumstances surrounding King Edward's death. Some mention an accident. Was it truly an accident? Or was Isabella involved? Without a doubt, the king's demise was immediately attributed to her, which proved to be extremely damaging to her reputation. A savior of the realm, yes. She succeeded in forcing the abdication of the bad king in favor of his son. Excellent. But why execute a deposed king? It was then that the epithet, the she-wolf, was first mentioned. The following year, the young King Edward III married Philippa of Hainaut, a long-promised bride, but she was not crowned and was even denied her own court, contrary to custom. Was Isabella afraid of a rival? The queen continued to rule, now showering honors on her favorite. Mortimer was granted the title of Earl of March. Roger's rise to power irritated Isabella's circle even more. For instance, by this time, her once loyal supporter Henry Lancaster had already left her, and now it was doubly so. Mortimer also behaved overly arrogantly. He had no idea that King Edward was already plotting another coup against him. 2 years later, the king's supporters burst into Mortimer's chambers. The Earl of March was captured, soon accused of treason, and sentenced to death. Isabella pleaded with her son to spare her favorite, but it was to no avail. Queen Isabella lost all influence. She was allowed to retreat to one of her castles. She regained everything she had lost before, and she chose rising. From then on, the king visited her infrequently, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. After a while, Isabella was permitted to reappear at court, and she happily participated in various celebrations and court festivities. In August 1358, Isabella died. Her burial was grand, but the grave of the Queen of England has not survived. As for her nickname, the She-Wolf, there are several explanations. The queen was an outstanding woman of her time, yet not devoid of cruelty. It is said that even during her lifetime, her enemies referred to her by that name. However, there is another version that suggests this nickname was coined later by Romantic writers.